In the quiet twilight of my years, with the serene silence of a peaceful evening enveloping my old study, I find the memories of war intrusively vivid, as if the past insists on being remembered. It is during these moments of solitude that my thoughts invariably drift back to one particular night, December 2nd, 1943. On that fateful evening, the coastal Italian town of Bari became the stage for a tragic spectacle that not only shaped the course of the Second World War, but also unwittingly paved the way for medical breakthroughs that would long outlive the conflict. The war, with all its chaos and calamity, seemed a distant reality to the bustling port of Bari, until the sky was set ablaze and the sea became a mirror reflecting the fiery havoc. As a young sergeant stationed at the port, tasked with managing the logistics of war materials, I was an unwitting witness to a disaster that would haunt me for decades. The events of that night unfolded with the suddenness of a storm, turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, embedding in my mind images and lessons that would endure beyond the cessation of hostilities. The harbor, usually resonant with the sounds of camaraderie and the mundane hustle of military routine, was violently transformed into a scene of devastation by a surprise Luftwaffe attack. Amidst the chaos, a secret danger lurked unbeknownst to us: the release of mustard gas from the American Liberty ship, the John Harvey, which carried hidden within its hold a cargo destined for a potential chemical retaliation that Hitler might never deploy. This is the story of that night, a night that witnessed not only the horror of unexpected warfare, but also sparked a chain of events leading to a serendipitous medical discovery. It's a tale of human resilience and the paradoxical nature of human invention, where instruments of war become tools for healing. As I recount these memories, I delve into a past that, despite the passage of many years, remains as sharp and impactful as the mustard gas that silently flowed through the waters of Bari's harbor. Welcome back to today's story. Before we dive into the main topic, please support us by liking this video. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. Bari, Italy, a picturesque port on the Adriatic coast, served as a crucial logistics hub for the Allied forces during the later stages of World War II. In the waning months of 1943, the port buzzed with activity, as men and materials streamed in to support the ongoing campaigns against Axis powers in Europe. I was stationed there as part of the logistics team, a role that involved coordinating the unloading and distribution of vital supplies, ranging from food and ammunition to medical equipment and reinforcements. The atmosphere in Bari was deceptively serene on the afternoon of December 2nd. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows and bathing the bustling docks in a soft golden light. Sailors, soldiers, and dock workers moved about their duties, their voices mingling with the clatter of crates and the occasional whistle of a passing train. There was laughter too, raucous and spirited, a testament to the resilience and camaraderie that defined our forces during those trying times. Amidst this routine chaos, the John Harvey sat quietly at its berth. To any casual observer, it was just another Liberty ship among the many that lined the harbor. Yet its holds contained a cargo far more ominous than the usual munitions: 2,000 M47, A1 mustard gas bombs, each a potential catastrophe intended as a retaliatory measure should the Axis powers resort to chemical warfare. This was a closely guarded secret, one that few in Bari were privy to, and one that I, despite my responsibilities, knew nothing about. As the day drew to a close, the air grew crisp, and the bustle of the port slowly subsided. Crews finished their shifts, and the night shift began its silent vigil. The local townspeople, accustomed to the constant presence of Allied troops, went about their evening routines, largely unaware of the strategic importance of their city in the larger theater of war. Dinner was a lively affair in the mess hall, where tales of home mingled with speculation about the war's progress and the usual grumblings about rations. Afterward, I joined a group of fellow soldiers for a brief walk along the docks, a ritual that helped us relax and momentarily forget the pressures of war. The Mediterranean air was bracing, filled with the scent of salt and diesel, a reminder of the vast logistical operation that continued around the clock. We laughed and shared cigarettes as we strolled past the rows of ships, their outlines stark against the night sky. There was an uneasy peace in the air, a sense of temporary suspension from reality, as if the war had decided to pass us by that evening. Little did we know that this tranquility was a mere illusion, soon to be shattered by the events that would unfold under the cover of darkness. As we returned to our barracks, the first distant drone of aircraft engines reached our ears, a sound that was becoming all too familiar. Yet, there was something different about it this time, something urgent and foreboding. We paused, glancing at each other with a mix of confusion and concern, then raced to our posts. The night's calm had been a deceptive prelude to one of the most devastating attacks we would experience during our service, an attack that would forever alter the course of many lives and leave an indelible mark on the history of warfare and medicine. Chapter 2. The Sky Ablaze. As we scrambled to our posts, the once tranquil evening air was shattered by the piercing wail of air raid sirens. They cut through the night, a dire warning that came all too late. By the time the first bombs fell, the port of Bari had been plunged into chaos, with men shouting orders and scrambling for cover under a sky now violently alive with the roar of German bombers. The Luftwaffe, in a precise and devastating attack, had targeted our supply lifeline in the Mediterranean. Their planes swooped low, unleashing a torrent of destruction that turned the night into day with bursts of explosive light. The harbor, so recently a scene of wartime normalcy, became a hellish landscape as fires ignited across the docks. Ships that had been silent sentinels by the water's edge were now ablaze, their hulls rupturing as munitions caught fire. Among the first targets hit was the John Harvey. The explosion aboard the ship was unlike any other that night. It was cataclysmic, sending a mushroom cloud of fire and debris into the sky. The force of the blast knocked us off our feet, and a heat wave swept over us, carrying with it an acrid, choking smell that was unfamiliar to most, but devastating in its effect. As the reality of the attack sank in, I struggled to regain my bearings. Around me, the world was a blur of fire-lit faces and the screams of the wounded. The harbor water, reflecting the fiery spectacle, was slick with oil and debris, making the rescue efforts treacherously slippery. Men jumped or were thrown into the water, desperate to escape the inferno on land, not realizing that a different peril awaited them in the oily, contaminated sea. We didn't know it then, but the explosion of the John Harvey had released a deadly payload into the air and water. The mustard gas, packed aboard in secrecy and meant for potential retaliation against a chemical attack from the Axis, now formed a poisonous cloud that hung over the harbor, invisible and insidious in its spread. Medical teams, unprepared for a chemical attack and overwhelmed by the immediate trauma of burns and blast injuries, worked frantically through the night. The docks transformed into a makeshift triage area, where the severity of injuries dictated the urgency of care. Amidst this, the subtle symptoms of mustard gas exposure began to manifest among the rescuers and rescued alike. Symptoms that were initially mistaken for other, less sinister conditions. As the hours ticked by, the initial chaos gave way to a more organized emergency response. Ships not caught in the immediate blasts began evacuation procedures, their crews working under the eerie light of fires that showed no signs of abating. From the shore, we could see the silhouettes of men against the flames, heroically maneuvering lifeboats and rafts, pulling survivors from the water. Yet with each passing hour, the hidden effects of the mustard gas became increasingly evident. Men who had seemed only minimally affected by the night's events began to show severe distress, their skin blistering and eyes swelling shut. The medical tents became scenes of confusion and despair as doctors tried to treat injuries they could not understand, with resources stretched to the breaking point. By dawn, the scale of the disaster was clear. Bari's port, a vital artery for the Allied war effort in Italy, had been dealt a severe blow, not just by the conventional weapons of war, but by an insidious agent that had been unleashed by our own unknowing hand. The ramifications of this night would unfold over the following days and weeks as the hidden toll of the chemical disaster began to emerge, challenging the mettle and morale of all who survived the ordeal. In the aftermath, as the sun rose over a smoldering port, the grim task of accounting for the dead and treating the myriad injuries continued. The attack on Bari would come to be known as the Little Pearl Harbor, a reference to the surprise and devastation it wrought. But unlike Pearl Harbor, the true extent of the tragedy at Bari, the chemical catastrophe, would remain shrouded in secrecy, its details obscured by the fog of war and the veils of military censorship. Chapter 3: Veil of Secrecy. As the first light of dawn washed over the devastated port, the extent of the previous night's chaos became heartbreakingly clear. The smoldering ruins of what had been a bustling logistical hub now lay eerily silent, save for the occasional crackle of dying fires and the soft lapping of oil-thick waves against the charred docks. The aftermath was grim. Survivors, many coated in a sticky mix of oil and seawater, wandered amongst the debris, some searching for missing comrades, others too stunned to do anything but stare at the destruction that surrounded them. Medical personnel, working tirelessly since the first bombs had dropped, continued to triage and treat the wounded, though their efforts were hampered by a growing realization that many of the injuries were not as straightforward as they had initially seemed. Unbeknownst to most at the time, the explosion of the John Harvey had released a cloud of mustard gas, which, combined with the massive quantities of burning fuel oil, created a toxic miasma that clung stubbornly to everything it touched. This insidious contamination was not immediately recognized, largely due to the chaos of the situation and the general unfamiliarity with chemical burn treatments among the medical staff. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Francis Alexander, a chemical warfare specialist, was urgently dispatched to Bari following a red light call to Allied Force headquarters in Algiers. Upon his arrival, Alexander was met with a scene of confusion and misinformation. The local military and medical personnel were overwhelmed, not only by the scale of the conventional injuries, but also by a mysterious pattern of symptoms that didn't match the expected outcomes of blast and burn trauma. With meticulous attention to detail, Alexander began his investigation into the mysterious symptoms. Despite the British Port Authority's initial denials of any chemical agents, his expertise led him to suspect that mustard gas was involved. His suspicions were confirmed as he observed the unique burns and respiratory issues afflicting the survivors, symptoms that were alarmingly consistent with exposure to mustard agents. As Alexander delved deeper into the disaster, he faced significant resistance from both British and American higher-ups. The potential political and military repercussions of admitting to a chemical weapon disaster were immense. There was a palpable fear that such an admission would not only cause panic among the civilian population, but could also provide the Axis powers with propaganda material and a pretext to escalate their own use of chemical weapons. Meanwhile, the medical crisis intensified. The initial lack of appropriate treatment for mustard gas exposure had tragic consequences. Hundreds of men who had been rescued from the water or had spent significant time in the gas-laden environment began to develop severe respiratory complications and skin lesions. The hospitals and makeshift medical facilities were soon overwhelmed with cases that they were ill-equipped to handle. Alexander's persistence in investigating the incident led to a critical understanding of the situation. He meticulously charted the positions of the ships in the harbor at the time of the attack and correlated them with the patterns of injuries among the survivors. His investigation pointed conclusively to the John Harvey as the source of the chemical explosion. On December 11, 1943, Alexander formally reported his findings to his superiors. His report detailed not only the presence of mustard gas, but also the severe implications of its unintended release. However, the response to his findings was mixed. While some in the military command were supportive, Others, including prominent figures like U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, were hesitant to acknowledge the incident publicly. The decision was made to impose a strict censorship policy on the disaster. Mentions of mustard gas were scrubbed from official records, and Alexander's medical findings were omitted from patient charts. The catastrophe at Bari was to be another war secret, buried in the classified files and the silent memories of those who had witnessed it. In the shadows of this enforced silence, a different kind of battle began to take shape, one for the truth and for the proper recognition and treatment of the men who had suffered from one of the war's hidden horrors. Chapter 4. Discovery Amid Despair. As the imposed silence enveloped the events at Bari, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Francis Alexander continued his work under the constraints of strict military censorship. The aftermath of the disaster was not just a battle against physical injuries, but also a struggle against the invisibility of chemical warfare's consequences. Alexander's determination to understand and document the effects of mustard gas exposure, despite the official push for secrecy, became a pivotal moment in medical and military history. As Alexander pieced together the horrific puzzle, he noticed that beyond the immediate burns and respiratory distress, there were alarming suppressive effects on the bone marrow and immune systems of the affected servicemen. These observations, though restricted from public knowledge, were meticulously recorded in his confidential reports, which laid the groundwork for an unexpected medical breakthrough. The daily routine in the medical tents was grueling. Doctors and nurses, initially baffled by the mysterious symptoms, gradually began to adapt to the peculiarities of the injuries thanks to Alexander's guidance. However, resources were stretched thin, and the shadow of the chemical disaster loomed large over their efforts. The medical staff, armed with new knowledge but limited by secrecy, had to tread a fine line between treating the affected and maintaining the mandated silence about the cause of their conditions. Amidst this clandestine crisis, another narrative began to unfold, one that would extend far beyond the confines of war. Colonel Cornelius P. Dusty Rhodes, then serving in the Chemical Warfare Service, became intrigued by Alexander's reports, which detailed the mustard gas's systemic effects on rapidly dividing cells. Rhodes, a prominent oncologist in civilian life, recognized the potential implications of these findings for cancer treatment. The idea that a weapon of war could lead to a tool in the fight against cancer was revolutionary. Mustard gas, known for its lethal ability to blister skin and mucous membranes and devastate bone marrow, inadvertently provided clues to a possible approach for attacking cancer cells, which also divide rapidly. This serendipitous discovery suggested that the chemical could be repurposed to target and kill these malignant cells. Rhodes and Alexander began a collaboration that extended beyond the immediate needs of the war. They initiated a series of controlled experiments, still under the veil of military secrecy, to explore how nitrogen mustards could be used therapeutically in oncology. These studies laid the foundation for what would eventually become known as chemotherapy. The transition of mustard gas from a weapon to a treatment was not without its ethical and moral complexities. The secrecy surrounding the Bari incident persisted, and many of the servicemen who suffered from the exposure never knew the role they inadvertently played in this groundbreaking discovery. The contradiction of benefiting from a weapon of mass destruction was not lost on those involved in the research, but the potential to save lives offered some redemption for the tragedy. As the war continued to rage on other fronts, the quiet work at Bari gradually began to bear fruit. By the time the conflict ended, preliminary results from the mustard gas research were promising enough to warrant further investigation in the peacetime world. The secrecy surrounding the Bari disaster slowly lifted, and the medical community began to recognize the potential of chemotherapy as a powerful tool against cancer. Chapter 5. Shadows Lifted. As the world transitioned from the shadows of war to the hopeful glow of peace, the story of Bari's tragic night and its aftermath began to seep into the broader public consciousness. The initial secrecy that enveloped the events gradually gave way under the pressure of emerging facts and persistent inquiries from those who refused to let the story remain hidden. In the post-war years, veterans and historians alike started piecing together the scattered reports and classified documents. The revelations about the use of mustard gas and its accidental release were shocking to many and provided a sobering reminder of the unintended consequences of war. These disclosures also sparked a public debate about the ethical dimensions of military secrecy and chemical warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Francis Alexander, who had been pivotal in both uncovering the truth and initiating the first steps towards using mustard compounds in cancer treatment, found himself at the center of this complex narrative. Although initially bound by military orders to maintain secrecy, Alexander became an advocate for transparency once the war ended. He argued that the lessons learned from Bari were too important to be kept from the medical community and the public. The ongoing collaboration between Alexander and Colonel Cornelius P. Dusty Rhodes, as well as other researchers in the emerging field of chemotherapy, led to significant advancements. The initial research on the effects of mustard gas on white blood cells was expanded to include various types of chemotherapy agents. By the mid-20th century, chemotherapy was recognized as a legitimate and crucial form of cancer treatment, marking a profound shift in oncology. The survivors of the Bari attack, many of whom suffered long-term health effects from their exposure to mustard gas, watched these developments with mixed emotions. For some, there was a sense of vindication and purpose, knowing that their suffering had contributed to a greater good. Others felt a deep sense of betrayal and sadness, pondering the price of progress and the moral complexities of benefiting from a weapon of war. The debate over the ethics of using data derived from wartime atrocities added another layer of complexity to the narrative. It forced medical professionals, ethicists, and the public to confront difficult questions about the sources of medical knowledge and the paths to scientific discovery. This discourse eventually contributed to more stringent ethical standards in medical research, emphasizing informed consent and the welfare of patients. As the 20th century progressed, the full impact of the events at Bari on both military policies and medical practices became clearer. The disaster not only transformed how the military handled chemical weapons, but also catalyzed changes in how civilian and military medical services prepare for and respond to chemical attacks. Chapter 6: Reflections and Reckonings. Looking back on the night of December 2nd, 1943, from the vantage point of decades, the Bari disaster serves as a stark reminder of the fog of war and the clarity that often comes only with hindsight. It is a story of human error, resilience, and redemption, of secrets buried and truths revealed. It underscores the paradoxes of human nature and the unpredictable ways in which adversity can lead to advances in understanding and technology. For those of us who lived through that night, the memories remain vivid, etched in our minds as clearly as the scars many bore on their bodies. Yet there is also a recognition of the broader historical significance of what occurred, a recognition that our experiences help to shape not just military tactics, but also medical breakthroughs that continue to save lives today. The legacy of Bari is multifaceted, woven into the fabric of medical history and military ethics. It reminds us of the importance of preparedness, the value of scientific curiosity, and the need for ethical vigilance in times of both war and peace. As we continue to navigate the complexities of modern conflicts and medical dilemmas, the lessons from Bari remain relevant, guiding us through the moral landscapes we must traverse in our ongoing quest for knowledge and humanity. Now, as I reflect on those harrowing days, I am struck by the dual nature of human ingenuity, the capacity for both destruction and healing. The Bari disaster remains a shadow over the bright victories of the war, a reminder of the costs and the unintended consequences of our darkest endeavors. But from that shadow sprang a light, a chance to fight a different kind of battle against disease. It is this complex tapestry of human experience that I carry with me, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there lies the potential for redemption and hope. Thank you for listening to the entire story. Don't forget to leave your feedback in the comments below. Your reviews will help us improve. Goodbye, and see you again.